History tells us that D-Day was won with steel, courage, and overwhelming force. But that is not the whole truth. The real story, the secret that guaranteed the success of the invasion, isn't about the army that landed in Normandy. It's about the other army, the Phantom Army, an army of ghosts, commanded by Patton, that never fired a single shot but held 19 German divisions captive, waiting for a battle that was nothing more than a whisper on the wind. The world at 30,000 feet is a place of profound, crystalline silence. Up here, in the thin, frigid air of a May morning in 1944, the only sounds are the steady, reassuring drone of your twin Junkers engines and the frantic, insistent drumming of your own heart. Below you, the green patchwork of Kent is laid out like a general's map, still swaddled in the last wisps of morning mist. You are Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the Luftwaffe's Special Reconnaissance Group, and you are, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. Your mission is not to fight, but to see. To be the all-seeing eye for a nervous high command, a high command that knows the invasion is coming, but doesn't know where. For weeks, this has been your hunting ground. You know the curve of every river, the shadow of every hedgerow. You have learned to read the landscape of southeastern England like a holy text, searching for the prophecies of war. You know what a division looks like when it sleeps the telltale spiderweb of truck tracks in a muddy field, the subtle dispersal of canvas tents under the cover of an orchard. You know the cold geometry of a supply depot, the brutal signature of an armored brigade digging in. You have seen the Allied buildup, yes. It is immense, frightening even. But it is a buildup you and your superiors have measured, calculated, and planned for. It is a known quantity. Until today, as you bank the aircraft, the early sun catches something new. It isn't a subtle change. It's a cataclysm. Where yesterday there were empty fields and quiet pastures stretching from Dover to the Thames estuary, today there is an army. No, not an army. An army group. An entity of such impossible scale that you have to physically check your own oxygen mask, wondering if hypoxia is finally claiming your senses. Your gloved hands, clumsy with cold, work the camera controls with a newfound urgency. Click-whir, click-whir. The Leica lenses, the pride of German engineering, drink in the scene below. It's all there. Endless, sprawling motor pools packed so tightly with Sherman tanks they look like metallic scales on the skin of the earth. Entire forests of artillery pieces, their long barrels glinting in the sun. Landing craft, hundreds of them choking the rivers and estuaries, pointing like daggers at the Pas-de-Calais, just a short hop across the channel. You can almost see the man himself down there, the swaggering American they call Patton, pacing in front of his command tent. This is it. This is the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, the largest single-field command in the Allied arsenal. It is the spearhead, the main event, and it is pointed directly at the throat of the Reich. A jolt of pure, triumphant adrenaline courses through you. This is the photograph that will change the war. This is the intelligence that will save the fatherland. Berlin will give you the Knight's Cross for this. They will name a street after you. The entire 15th Army is dug in at Calais, waiting, and you have just handed them the enemy's battle plan on a silver plate. You are already composing the report in your mind, massive concentration of armor and infantry invasion, imminent target Pas-de-Calais confirmed. But then a flicker, a small, discordant note in the grand symphony of war below. You push your goggles up, leaning closer to the thick cockpit glass. Something is wrong. It's a feeling, a pilot's intuition, the kind of deep, animal instinct that separates the living from the dead in the skies over Europe. You look at the tanks again, thousands of them, and you think of the mud. You know English mud. It is a greedy, grasping thing. A 30-ton Sherman tank does not sit on a field, it presses into it. It leaves scars. It churns the earth into a brown pulp with every turn of its tracks. The ground around a real armored division should be a chaotic mire of deep ruts and brutalized soil. But down there it's too clean. The grass around the tanks is still green. The tracks leading to their positions are unnaturally straight, almost painted on. One tank, near the edge of a field, seems to be sitting at a slightly odd angle. Its turret just a little too perfect, its shadow just a little too sharp, lacking the soft, heavy weight of steel. It's a detail so small, so insignificant, that your conscious mind screams to ignore it. It's a trick of the light, the altitude, the strain. And yet, the feeling grows. a cold knot of doubt in the pit of your stomach. You have spent your life studying the grim reality of war, the messy, imperfect, brutal truth of it. What you are looking at down below is perfect. Too perfect. You had just photographed the most powerful invasion force ever assembled. So why did you feel like you had just witnessed a magic trick? In the sterile, pine-paneled confines of a briefing room deep within the wolf's lair, the air is thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. Hauptmann Weber's photographs are projected onto a massive screen, each one a testament to German foresight. The images are breathtakingly clear. The tanks, the artillery, the landing craft, they form an undeniable, ironclad argument. Here, in the rarefied atmosphere of high command, a pilot's vague intuition about cleanliness carries no weight against the overwhelming physical evidence. The generals, men whose entire world is defined by maps and unit designations, see exactly what they want to see. Colonel Alexis von Wren, the meticulous head of Fremdheer West, the Wehrmacht's intelligence branch for the Western Front, stands beside the screen, a long wooden pointer in his hand. He is the architect of this certainty. "Gentlemen," he announces, his voice resonating with the quiet confidence of a man whose theories have just been proven correct. "This is FUSAG, the 1st U.S. Army Group. Our estimates put it at over 1 million men. Commanded by Patton. Its posture is aggressive, its deployment forward. Every piece of intelligence we have gathered over the past 6 months, the agent reports, the double-cross system, the supply chain analysis points to one inescapable conclusion." He taps the pointer firmly on the map of the French coast. "The invasion, the Schwerpunkt, will be here. The Pas-de-Calais." A murmur of agreement ripples through the room. It is the perfect, logical explanation. It fits. The Allies would naturally want to attack at the narrowest point of the channel, the shortest sea route, the quickest path to the industrial heart of Germany. To believe otherwise would be to believe the Allies were incompetent. And so, the official story is cemented not in steel, but in the concrete of unshakable logic. Weber's report of an army group is accepted as fact. His subtle doubts are filed away as a footnote, the understandable anxiety of a young pilot. The order is given: reinforce the 15th Army at Calais. Strip the defenses from Normandy, from Brittany. Everything must be staked on this single, absolute certainty. But war, you see, is not just a battle of divisions, it's a battle of perception. And while the German high command was looking, someone else was listening. In a damp concrete bunker buried in the cliffs of Cap Gris-Nez, a young Unteroffizier named Klaus Richter sits hunched over a Telefunken radio set, a bulky set of headphones clamped over his ears. His world is not one of maps and grand strategy, but of static, hiss, and the faint, ghostly whispers that travel across the salt water. His job is to listen to the giant, the FUSAG, as it prepares for battle. For weeks, he has cataloged its voice, the endless, mundane chatter of a modern army. Requests for fuel, complaints about food, coordination for training exercises. Tonight, however, Klaus is troubled. He is a musician in civilian life, a cellist with an ear for nuance, for rhythm, for the tiny imperfections that define a human performance. And the performance he is listening to is just too good. He hears 1,000 different radio operators, but the rhythm of their Morse code, their fist, is unervingly similar. He listens to American sergeants arguing, but their slang feels studied, rehearsed. It's like listening to a recording of a crowd, where you slowly begin to realize you're hearing the same 10 coughs and sneezes looped over and over again. An army of 1 million men should be a cacophony of human error and personality. It should be a messy, chaotic, unpredictable orchestra. The radio traffic of FUSAG was a perfect, repeating, fatal symphony. Klaus pulls a fresh sheet of paper from his logbook. His superiors will call him mad. The photographic evidence from the Luftwaffe is absolute. But he cannot shake the feeling. He writes his report, his pencil scratching nervously in the quiet bunker. He notes the identical spacing in the Morse signals. He highlights the recycled phrasing in the voice transcripts. He doesn't have the language of a general. He cannot speak of strategy or logistics. He can only report what his ears, the most sensitive instruments in the bunker, are telling him. He signs the report, concluding with a single, chilling observation: the same man, with the same fist, is pretending to be 100 different radio operators, and he is getting tired. He hands it to the courier, and watches it disappear into the command structure. A single, contradictory note sent to challenge a masterpiece of deception. The official explanation was clean, simple, and satisfying. 1,000,000 men were poised to strike at Calais. But a quiet, methodical report was now climbing the ladder of the German High Command, a report that suggested the largest army in the world had the radio signature of a single, repeating broadcast. Let's talk about the art of misdirection. In a magic show, the magician directs your gaze to his right hand, the one holding the glittering coin, while his left hand, the one in the shadows, prepares the trick. War is no different, but the stakes are infinitely higher. The glittering coin is a 1,000,000-man army. The shadow is a coastline 500 miles long. And the trick is the liberation of an entire continent. The anomaly of the repeating radio signals, the nagging doubt about the unnaturally green grass, these were not mere curiosities. They were cracks in the foundation of Germany's entire defensive strategy for Western Europe. To ignore them was to gamble the future of the Third Reich on the assumption that your enemy is an idiot. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was many things, but he was not a man who believed his enemies were idiots. From his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the old Prussian aristocrat, the supreme commander in the West, looked at the photographs of Fusag and felt a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth. It was the taste of doubt. He had fought the British before. He knew their methods. They were masters of the feint, the indirect approach, the strategy of the ghost. They would never, ever place their entire invasion force in one neat, easily photographed basket. It was too obvious. It was un-British. The existence of Fusag at Dover was a strategic fact, but its purpose was a strategic mystery. And in war, a mystery of this magnitude isn't a puzzle to be solved at one's leisure. It's a ticking bomb. If Fusag was the glittering coin, then where was the left hand? Where was the real threat? The German 15th Army, a massive force of 19 divisions, was now dug in like ticks at the Pas-de-Calais, their guns pointed at an enemy who might not even be there. Meanwhile, to the west, the long, sandy beaches of Normandy were held by a skeleton crew of second-rate divisions, older men, and ill-equipped conscripts from the occupied territories. It was a coastline protected by little more than the theory that no sane commander would attempt a major landing so far from the nearest deep-water port. This is where we must pause for a war college briefing. Think of a fortress. Its main gate is made of solid oak, reinforced with steel, guarded by a dozen archers. That's the Pas-de-Calais. But 100 yards down the wall, there's a small, forgotten postern gate, its hinges rusted, guarded by a single, sleepy sentry. That's Normandy. The entire logic of Fortress Europe was based on the simple, arrogant assumption that the Allies would knock on the front door. But what if they knew about the back door? What if the massive, noisy army at the main gate was just a distraction, designed to draw every last guard away from that one, vulnerable spot? The risk wasn't just losing a battle, it was losing the entire fortress in a single, catastrophic stroke. The stakes were now terrifyingly clear. If Fusag was real, reinforcing Calais was the only move that could save Germany. But if Fusag was a phantom, a ghost army conjured out of thin air, then reinforcing Calais was the very move that would doom Germany. Every tank, every man, every artillery piece moved to the 15th Army was a nail hammered into the coffin of the Normandy defenders. The German war machine was now caught in a strategic paralysis. To move was to risk being fatally wrong. To stay still was to risk the same. The ghost was no longer just a rumor on the radio waves, it was a specter haunting the highest levels of the Wehrmacht, forcing them to question their own eyes, their own logic, and their own most fundamental assumptions about the enemy. And so, deep within the clandestine world of Allied intelligence, a new, desperate mission was born, not of strategy, but of necessity. They had to keep the ghost alive. They had to make the phantom breathe, eat, and bleed. The photographs and the radio signals were not enough. They needed to give their spectral army a body. They needed to move from illusion to outright fraud. This mission fell to a bizarre collection of Allied creatives, a secret war waged by men who fought with imagination as their primary weapon. In the damp, chilly spring of 1944, a very strange kind of artist colony began to sprout in the fields of Kent and Essex. This mission, codenamed Operation Fortitude, was a symphony of deception with many conductors. In the fields, The U.S. Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a top-secret unit of artists, architects, and engineers, prepared the visual and sonic illusions. Working in concert with them were their British counterparts in MI5, who marshaled a stable of double agents to give the Phantom Army a human voice, and sonic warfare experts who perfected the art of fake radio traffic. History would remember the American unit, decades later, as the Ghost Army. Their first task was to give substance to the Phantom. The American commander, Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a folksy, pragmatic engineer, gathered his bizarre collection of creatives. "Gentlemen," he might have said, pointing to an empty pasture, "General Patton requires a new armored division here by sunrise. Get to work." And the artists would descend. The first clue to their methods was a sound that would become the anthem of their secret war, the steady, rhythmic hiss of compressed air. From the backs of trucks, they would unroll what looked like enormous, collapsed rubber balloons. With a cough and a roar, the air compressors would spring to life, and before the eyes of the bewildered local farmers, a miracle would take place. Limp, olive-drab canvas would slowly rise from the grass, swelling, taking shape, its wrinkles smoothing out until, in a matter of minutes, a perfect M4 Sherman tank stood gleaming in the English sun. It was 93 pounds of rubber and air, but from Hauptmann Weber's reconnaissance plane at 30,000 feet, it was 30 tons of American steel. This was their first and most vital clue in the investigation of the German mind. The enemy believed what they could see. So, the Ghost Army gave them a spectacle. They didn't just inflate one tank, they inflated hundreds. They became masters of mass production illusion. They created entire divisions of inflatable Shermans, inflatable artillery pieces, inflatable transport trucks. Architectural students, who just months before were designing libraries, now meticulously calculated the precise dispersal patterns of a resting armored battalion. They understood that a real unit would never park its vehicles in neat, perfect rows. So they created a kind of organized chaos, a beautiful, fraudulent mess. They would even use a bulldozer to carve a single, convincing set of tank tracks into the mud leading up to a field of 50 rubber decoys, knowing that the eye in the sky would fill in the rest. They weren't just building props, they were building a story. A believable lie, told in the language of aerial photography. This was the first piece of the puzzle, the visual evidence, laid out for German intelligence to find, a breadcrumb trail leading them further and further away from the truth of Normandy. But a photograph, however convincing, is a silent, static thing. An army makes noise. It has a voice. The German radio listeners, like the young Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, were not fools. They were expecting to hear the heartbeat of Fusag, and a silent army was a dead army. This is where the initial lead, the visual deception, risked becoming a dead end. The German high command was devouring the aerial photographs, yes, but their signals intelligence teams were raising red flags. The recycled call signs, the unervingly perfect Morse code, the very anomalies Richter had noted were being debated in intelligence circles. The beautiful visual lie was threatening to collapse under the weight of a clumsy sonic one. This is where the enemy, the personification of doubt in the German command, showed its genius. They weren't just looking, they were cross-referencing. They were running a multi-layered investigation of their own. A photograph of a tank division was compelling, but it was worthless if the corresponding radio chatter didn't speak of fuel shortages, ammunition requests, and the 1,000 other logistical headaches that plague a real armored unit. The Ghost Army had successfully built the body of the monster, but they had failed to give it a convincing roar. The simple theory that a bunch of rubber tanks would be enough had shattered against the sophisticated reality of German signals intelligence. This forced the artists of deception to evolve. They had to become not just painters and sculptors, but actors and playwrights. The second phase of their operation was born in a series of mobile recording vans, staffed by British sound engineers who, just a year prior, were producing radio dramas for the BBC. Their mission to write and perform the daily life of a million-man army. They drove their vans to the real encampments of Patton's actual, albeit much smaller, command group. There, they spent weeks recording every sound imaginable. They captured the unique rumble of a Sherman tank's engine at idle versus full throttle. They recorded the clatter of mess kits, the bark of a frustrated supply sergeant, the arguments of a GI poker game, the rhythmic cadence of boot-clad feet on a training march. They built a sonic library of war. Began. From mobile radio trucks hidden in the woods of Kent, they began broadcasting their masterpiece. Using a technique they called spoof radio, they created a vast, overlapping, and utterly fraudulent soundscape. An actor from Brooklyn, given a script of GI slang, would get on the radio and pretend to be a tank commander named Big Ed from the 5th Armored Division, complaining about the quality of the British beer. A sound engineer would then skillfully mix in the pre-recorded sound of tank maintenance in the background. Different operators, using specially designed keyers to mimic the unique fist of individual Morse code operators, would transmit fake logistical orders from one fictional unit to another. They were not just hunters of German belief anymore, they were now being hunted by German skepticism, and their survival depended on the quality of their performance. For all their artistry, the men of the 23rd were keenly aware that they were walking a tightrope. An inflatable tank could be punctured. A radio script could be found wanting. Their deception was a magnificent but fragile thing, a theatrical production staged on the edge of a volcano. They needed something more, a way to anchor their elaborate fiction in the messy, undeniable reality of the physical world. The breakthrough came not from a general's master plan, but from a source so mundane it was almost comical: the laundry bills and bar tabs of a sleepy English town. This next layer of the investigation was led by a different kind of artist, the double agent. Under the umbrella of the famed double-cross system, Britain's MI5 was running a stable of captured German spies, men who had been turned and were now dutifully feeding misinformation back to their handlers in Berlin. The most famous of these was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British. Garbo was not just an agent, he was a one-man intelligence agency, a virtuoso of deception who had convinced the Abwehr that he was running a network of over 24 sub-agents across Britain. In reality, his entire network was a fiction, a cast of characters he had invented in his own fertile imagination. Garbo was the unlikely source who could give the Ghost Army its flesh and blood. While the 23rd was inflating their tanks and broadcasting their sonic illusions, Garbo was busy writing the novel of Fusag's daily life. He would report to Berlin, with breathless urgency, about his fictional agent in Dover, who had just seen a massive column of American tanks rumbling through the town square. Then, to make the lie tangible, a handful of real Sherman tanks from Patton's actual headquarters would be ordered to do just that: drive a noisy, conspicuous circuit through Dover, rattling the windows and churning up the streets, before disappearing back into the countryside. The genius was in the layering of detail. A few days later, another of Garbo's imaginary agents, a dock worker, would report a sudden shortage of beer in all the local pubs, a clear sign of thousands of thirsty American GS in the area. The Ghost Army would then dispatch a few real soldiers, men with authentic Brooklyn accents, to go on a highly visible pub crawl, complaining loudly about the warm beer and their overbearing commander, General Patton. These small, verifiable details: a real tank track in the mud, a real barman complaining about rowdy Americans, a real laundry service overwhelmed with olive-drab uniforms, were the anchors. They were tiny, observable truths that gave credibility to the larger, monumental lie. They were the critical pieces of evidence that allowed the German high command to connect the dots, to see the pattern they so desperately wanted to see, and to dismiss the lingering, uncomfortable questions about ghost signals and perfectly manicured lawns. With every layer of deception meticulously laid, the visual, the sonic, the human, the architects of Operation Fortitude began to assemble a picture of the truth. But it was not the truth of Allied intentions. It was a far more dangerous and uncomfortable truth about their own side. The very success of their operation revealed a deep, systemic flaw in the German intelligence apparatus. It wasn't just that the Germans were being fooled, it was that they seemed institutionally incapable of not being fooled. They were swallowing the bait hook, line, and sinker with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. The uncomfortable truth was this: the German high command was a prisoner of its own logic. Allied intelligence, by analyzing the Wehrmacht's reactions, began to realize they weren't just fighting an army, they were exploiting a rigid, dogmatic mindset. The Germans had a checklist for what an invasion preparation should look like, a checklist born from years of studying their own successful blitzkrieg tactics. It required a massive concentration of armor. It required overwhelming air support. It required the shortest possible sea route for logistics. The Pas-de-Calais, and only the Pas-de-Calais, ticked every single box on that list. Normandy, with its lack of a major port and its greater distance, failed on almost every count. The Ghost Army wasn't just an illusion, it was a carefully crafted confirmation bias. It was designed to tell Hitler, von Rundstedt, and the entire Oberkommando der Wehrmacht exactly what their own strategic doctrine told them was true. The agents of fortitude weren't just deceiving the enemy, they were holding up a mirror to the enemy's own deepest held beliefs. This created a new, internal conflict for the Allied planners. Was the deception working too well? Was it possible that the Germans were so completely convinced, so utterly blinded by the phantom of Fusag, that they might not react at all when the real landings began in Normandy? The fear was that the first reports of Allied paratroopers and landing craft on the beaches of Utah and Omaha would be dismissed in Berlin as a mere diversion, a feint designed to draw forces away from the real invasion site at Calais. The success of the Ghost Army had inadvertently created a new and terrible risk. They had built their monster so convincingly that its imaginary threat might completely overshadow the real one. They had crafted a lie so perfect that the truth, when it finally arrived on the morning of June 6th, would sound like the most unbelievable fiction of all. The uncomfortable truth was that the D-Day invasion now depended not just on overwhelming force, but on the Germans continuing to believe in a ghost, even as real men were bleeding and dying on the shores of France. Within the German command structure, the Phantom Army had become an article of faith. The official narrative, flowing down from Hitler's headquarters, was absolute. Fusag is real, Patton is its commander, and the Pas-de-Calais is the target. The system, a vast bureaucracy built on obedience and the Führer's infallibility, now began to actively push back against any information that contradicted this established truth. The Ghost Army was no longer just deceiving the Wehrmacht, it was leveraging the Wehrmacht's own rigid hierarchy against itself. Remember the young radio operator, Klaus Richter, and his report on the strange, repeating radio signals? It had been dismissed. His superiors, faced with a mountain of photographic evidence and double-agent reports, filed it away as a technical anomaly. Remember Hauptmann Weber, the reconnaissance pilot, and his nagging intuition about the impossibly clean tank parks? His concerns were noted in a debriefing memo and then promptly buried under the weight of his own conclusive photographs. These men, the ones on the ground with their hands on the raw data, were the investigators closest to the truth. But their whispers of doubt could not compete with the roar of the official story. The most dramatic example of the system pushing back came in the form of one of its most brilliant minds, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Tasked with inspecting and strengthening the Atlantic Wall, Rommel was a man obsessed with the ground truth. He walked the beaches. He talked to the NCOs. He felt the tide and tasted the salt in the air. While the generals at the Wolf's Lair saw the war as a chess game of unit symbols on a map, Rommel saw it as a brutal, physical struggle of sand, steel, and blood. And his instincts screamed that Normandy was the weak point. He argued, pleaded, and cajoled for reinforcements, particularly for the elite panzer divisions to be moved closer to the Normandy coast, where they could counterattack any landing force within hours. Rommel's own battle diary from this period reflects his agony, noting his warnings were falling on deaf ears at high command. He was denied. The logic from high command was simple and, on paper, irrefutable. The panzers were the strategic reserve. They could not be committed to a secondary front like Normandy when the main Allied blow, the hammer of Fusag, was poised to fall on Calais. To move the panzers would be to fall for precisely the kind of diversion the Allies might attempt. Rommel's desperate warnings, born from a visceral understanding of the battlefield, were treated as a form of strategic hysteria. He was a brilliant tactician, they conceded, but he lacked the grand strategic overview. He was being insubordinate, questioning a certainty that had been established at the very highest level. The system wasn't just ignoring the evidence, it was punishing the investigator who presented it. The Ghost now had an unlikely and powerful ally, the suffocating bureaucracy of the Third Reich itself. This is the lowest point. The moment where the investigator, having found the truth, is utterly silenced. For Erwin Rommel, the price of his truth was strategic impotence. He was the commander responsible for defending the French coast. Yet the very weapons he needed to do so the panzer divisions were held on a tight leash hundreds of miles away, kept in reserve to fight a ghost. Imagine being the fire chief of a city, knowing with absolute certainty which building is about to erupt in flames, only to have the mayor forbid you from moving your fire trucks from the other side of town because he's convinced a different, grander fire is coming. This was Rommel's personal hell in the final weeks before the invasion. His lowest point can be pinpointed to a specific date, June 4, 1944. The weather in the English Channel was atrocious. Gale-force winds whipped the sea into a frenzy. Meteorologists at Luftwaffe headquarters confidently predicted that the storms would make any amphibious landing impossible for at least several days. Believing this, and feeling the crushing weight of his powerlessness, Rommel made a fateful decision. He decided to leave the front. He packed his car and drove to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6, planning to go on from there to personally appeal to Hitler for control of the panzer divisions. He left the coast of France convinced that nothing could possibly happen in his absence. The truth he had championed had been so thoroughly rejected that he felt his own presence was irrelevant. The system had won. And so, as Rommel's car sped east toward Germany, the gears of the real invasion, which had been paused for 24 hours due to the storm, were grinding back into motion. General Eisenhower, after a tense, sleepless night, had received a sliver of a weather window from his own forecasters. He gave the fateful order, "Okay, let's go." The disaster that Rommel had tried to prevent was now irrevocably in motion. The greatest amphibious assault in human history was steaming towards the very beaches he had identified as the most vulnerable, and he was hundreds of miles away, on his way to a birthday party. The intricate, beautiful, and utterly damnable deception of the Ghost Army had achieved its ultimate purpose. It had not only convinced the German High Command to look the wrong way, it had convinced their most capable battlefield commander that the fight wasn't even on. The stage was set for a catastrophe, not because of a failure of German intelligence, but because of its greatest, most tragic success. The men on the Normandy beaches were about to pay the price for a truth their own generals had refused to believe. The catastrophe unfolded in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper, the whisper of thousands of silk parachutes blossoming against a moonlit sky. The first reports that trickled into the headquarters of the German 7th Army in Normandy were confused, fragmented, and utterly bizarre. Paratroopers landing, but in small, scattered groups. Sightings of gliders. Some reports even mentioned dummies, mannequins dressed in paratrooper uniforms, rigged with firecrackers to simulate firefights. This was the Ghost Army's final, masterful performance, a parting shot of confusion. To the German commanders on the ground, it looked exactly like what they had been told to expect: a diversion, a feint. The general in charge, Friedrich Dahlmann, did what any commander would do when faced with a sideshow. He refused to panic. He refused to wake his superiors. He certainly didn't request the release of the panzer divisions. That would be playing right into the Allies' hands. He handled it as a local problem. Then, as the sun began to rise, the true nature of the event revealed itself. The sea, which had been empty the night before, was now black with ships. A forest of masts and funnels stretching to the horizon. Over 6,000 vessels. The largest armada in the history of the world. The naval bombardment began, a rolling thunder that shook the very foundations of the Atlantic Wall. And then, the landing craft came, their ramps dropping into the surf, disgorging tens of thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers onto the beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The dramatic irony is almost too painful to contemplate. In the bunkers of the 15th Army at the Pas-de-Calais, 19 of the Wehrmacht's best divisions sat, waiting, listening to the distant thunder from the west. Their machine guns were clean, their ammunition was stacked, and their eyes were peeled for the real invasion. For hours, even as Omaha Beach became a charnel house and the Allies clawed their way ashore, the official assessment from Hitler's headquarters remained unchanged. This was an elaborate, costly, but ultimately diversionary attack designed to draw the panzers away from Calais. The order was firm: hold your positions. Wait for Patton. For a full 7 weeks after D-Day, the Ghost Army continued its performance in Kent. They inflated new tanks, broadcast new radio traffic, and had Garbo send reports of Fusag growing even larger, preparing for the decisive blow. And the German high command, trapped in the beautiful prison of logic the Allies had built for them, continued to believe. The powerful panzer divisions that could have driven the Allies back into the sea on June 6th or 7th were kept in reserve, waiting for an attack that would never come, held in check not by steel, but by an army of artists, actors, and inflatable rubber balloons. For decades, the story remained buried, locked away in files stamped top secret. The official histories of D-Day were written, focusing on the courage of the soldiers, the genius of the logistics, the sheer industrial might of the Allied war machine. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops went home, sworn to secrecy. The set designers went back to the West End, the artists to their studios, the sound engineers to the BBC. They told no one. They couldn't. To their friends and families, they were just soldiers who had served in England, far from the real fighting. Their war was a secret they carried in silence. The declassified file, the moment the fog finally lifted for the public, didn't come until 1996. A full 52 years after the invasion, the United States government officially declassified the records of the 23rd. Suddenly, a hidden chapter of the war was opened. The entire orthodox history of D-Day was suddenly thrown into question. Historians who had written the definitive accounts were forced to reckon with the fact that one of the most decisive factors in the battle was an army of ghosts they never knew existed. Old men, now in their 70s and 80s, were finally able to speak. A former painter named Bill Blass, who would become a world-famous fashion designer, could finally talk about the summer he spent painting camouflage on inflatable tanks. A young soldier named Arthur Shilstone, who had sketched the battlefields, could finally show the drawings he had kept hidden in his attic. The truth came out not in a single, dramatic revelation, but in a slow cascade of personal stories, declassified memos, and after-action reports that had gathered dust for half a century. They revealed the sheer scale and audacity of the deception. They detailed the sonic scripts, the inflatable order of battle, the coordination with the double-cross agents. They vindicated the nagging doubts of men like Hauptmann Weber, the pilot who saw a world that was too clean, and Klaus Richter, the radio operator who heard a symphony that was too perfect. And they laid bare the tragic, fatal paralysis of the German command, confirming that for weeks after the largest invasion in history, Hitler and his generals were still waiting for a phantom army, an army that existed only in the imaginations of a few hundred Allied artists. The secret was out, and the true, almost unbelievable, story of D-Day could finally be told.